Good morning. Stanley is having a drink, so I cannot attack the window. Here we are. Welcome to the Single Glaze Club. Cannot attack the window with my squeegee, which was one of the most satisfying things I do in the mornings, but I'll have to wait until his lordship has had his morning constitutional drink. So, Bridget Phillipson. She wrote the most obnoxious tweet yesterday, and I'm not even going to go into that because actually I don't really want to give her the airtime, but it was on that particular tweet. But it was effectively telling you what reform will do to the education system if they get in, whilst citing what they've done to the education system in reform's words and saying it's bad. So Bridget talks that reform will cut budgets, having cut budgets. So Bridget would like to project onto you that if reform get into Parliament, they will be bad for education. Now, this is coming from a woman who has cut budgets, who has cut learning programmes, that affect some of the most vulnerable sectors in educational society. So we know that girls study differently and have different challenges to boys. We know that white middle class boys and white working class boys face certain struggles in the educational system. Help yourselves down. We know that kids with special educational needs are really up against it in our educational system. We know that if you want to do something other than the state system, then that is widely mocked, disparaged and looked down upon. Yet we don't accept that we are taking away our own children's presence from the state system, thus freeing it up for another child. So Bridget Phillipson has a very polarised view on what she would like to do with education, and effectively it's wreck it. Now, she's been told every step of this educational journey what will happen if she implements things in the negative. And whilst all of this is going on in the background, at the foreground, we have an article which says, you see, I've got my contact lenses on, so I have to do a bit of backwards and forwards. Councils say the government cannot keep ducking reforms to the special educational needs and disabilities system as new research reveals a system on course for total collapse within local authorities facing an unimaginable deficit of 18 billion by the end of this Parliament. So let's wind this back for those of you that aren't interested in children, because that's fine. But you are interested in local authorities. You are interested in what your local authority can do for you. Well, at the minute, with the rise in SEND, not a lot is the long and the short of it. Where you would like the money to be going into other avenues, it won't be, because it's going into SEND. Now, SEND has risen for several reasons. People would like to tell you that it's because we diagnose anything now. You know, I'm having a glass of water. Oh, that's dyslexic. I'm having a drink. Oh, that's got autism. And you get lots of disparaging comments from people saying, they'll find a protected characteristic for my tree next. No, what's happening is a bit like the solar system was always there. It was always there. But until we had telescopes, we couldn't see it. There we are. So the special educational needs, and I hate the word disabilities, but let's go with it because that's what they formally call it, that system has always been needed. There have always been individuals with special educational needs and disabilities. You may be one of them. You may have been at school and you may have been dyslexic, you may have been autistic, you still will be. You may have had challenges at school, but back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, we didn't cater for it. We didn't have our telescope. Now we've got our telescope, we can see the solar system. We can see what these educational needs and disabilities are, in the same way that we're making great strides in cancer treatments and therapies, and dementia treatments and therapies. We're not going fast enough, but we are going somewhere. Now, of course, when we talk about making advances in things like that, people applaud them. When we talk about making advances in things like neurodivergency, we say it's just another label that people want and they've made it up. I'm not sure why we have such a hypocritical double standard towards this, but we do. And it's interesting when certain generations will talk about children with neurodivergences and say, we didn't have that in my day, you've just got to get on with it. There was a woman on X yesterday, Patricia Vale, I don't know how you pronounce her surname, who was so completely condescending and disparaging towards parents who had chosen to send their their children to the independent sector, that she said, surely if they've got some spare money in their pockets after their fees, they could put that into the state sector. Wow. So she would like those parents to pay for their own children's education and then everyone else's education, even though they already are through their income tax. We had another lady whose profile picture looked as though she was in probably her early 60s. Of course, you never know with profile pictures. She could have been 21. But it looked like she was in her early 60s. And she said, oh dear, poor... And she gave the typical names that people like to make up for children in the independent sector. Poor mummy and daddy can't afford the fees anymore. My heart bleeds. Wow. So we've got that to contend with. But of course, if somebody had chosen to go into private healthcare for cancer treatment, do you think we'd say the same? Probably not. I'm not suggesting that these people wouldn't. It strikes me as though they would say that about anyone. So we have a SEND system that is in crisis, and it hasn't been in crisis because we found our telescope and we've seen that children have needs in the same way that we had needs, but we perhaps didn't have our needs met. And going back generations before, then there were definite needs. You know, talking to my own father, who, when we talk about the autism, that I'm first generation, my children are second generation, my father says, well, I'm sure I have some kind of autism. I'm sure I'm on the spectrum somewhere. Now, my father says that openly. We don't know whether he is. He's just putting the dots together, and the way his brain is working, I would say it probably is, because it's that kind of outwards thinking, out of the box thinking, that is the beauty of a spicy neurodivergent brain, and that acceptance and openness. Regardless of whether he is or whether he isn't, I absolutely adore him for meeting me equally with my children. And that, go dad, love you. So my dad is open enough to know that when he was at school, there wasn't the telescope, there wasn't the help. So it wasn't that we didn't need to help children, we just pushed them in a corner and told them they were stupid. Yet now that we have recognised that we do need to help the future generation, and let's see them like that, we do need to help the next lot of children that will become adults, and do we want them to become the adults that we already have that weren't supported, then we need to do something about it. And that comes through local authorities. Now, local authorities aren't being funded properly to support these kids. What we're doing, what Bridget Phillipson is doing, is saying, well, I'll train teaching assistants to deal with it. Okay. So all the educational psychologists, all the specialists who have been trained, have gone to university, have done degrees, have done PhDs, have done extensive learning into neurodiversity, we're now going to get classroom assistants to do a 3-week Zoom training course to teach them how to work with neurodivergent children. And for some of them, that will be enlightening, because for some children, it will just be a tweak here and a tweak there. But for a lot of children, it's significantly more than that, which is why we have SEND, which is why we have EHCPs, which is why we have a system supporting these children. It's not doing it very well. In fact, it's doing it appallingly. But we've recognised that we need it. But instead of investing in that, both educationally, emotionally, financially, and across the board, what we're doing is pushing it to the back room, a little bit like the Victorian times. We're tying a hand up behind one child's back and saying, right, with the other one, you can do it, you know you want to. And then perhaps when they don't turn to school because they can't face school, then they go to a behaviour hub or an attendance hub, because that's what we do to children these days. So Bridget Phillipson has told you that bad and nasty things are going to happen when Nigel Farage gets in, if Nigel Farage gets in. Yet when we look at the actual picture of what's happening now on the educational landscape, these bad and nasty things are already happening. In fact, they're happening at a rate of knots. If we look at what Bridget Phillipson inherited, and we know we don't really like to go back and do that, but let's just break our own rules for a second, because it's not like the Labour government don't. If we look at what she inherited, whilst it wasn't perfect by any stretch, it was working. It was, at least, I would say, limping with a bit of a blister through. It definitely needed some rehab, but the nuts and bolts were there. We just needed to invest quite heavily, and we needed to do that both financially and educationally. We needed to listen to the educational leaders within the sector, and we needed to consult with them, and we needed to ask them what it was they needed and how we could best support them. We didn't need to throw around free breakfasts and tell people they could have 50 quid off their school uniform. That's not going to cut the mustard, and it hasn't cut the mustard, and that is why the system is falling apart. And that is why when articles come out like this saying the SEND system will completely implode, by the end of this parliament, that those of us who are involved in that SEND system go, yeah, you're damn right, it will. Now, you may then turn around and say to me, well, VAT on education is going to solve that. Well, in an ideal world, it would, wouldn't it? If we could have that injection of money that could come into the system and that was used wisely, then it would certainly help. It wouldn't hinder. Apart from the fact there's massive flaws with that, because we're talking about taking money from the very same educational setting that we want to fix. So we're taking money from education, from children, and when children can't afford that education in the independent sector, they go into the state sector that we're trying to fix. But we can only fix it if we don't have any more children in it. And we can only fix it if we don't overburden it with a different sector. But what we've done is overburden it with a different sector and have more children in it. And we can only fix it if the revenue we think we're going to raise is actually real. So that revenue has to exist. It has to be actual money to go into an actual pot. But what happened was, as soon as VAT on education went on to education, that money was apparently siphoned for social housing. Now, I don't know how you can do that, because you're not supposed to hypothecate tax. It's not supposed to go to one particular place. But Keir Starmer told us that without VAT on education, we would not have had the biggest revolution in social housing ever. So what children have done is, with their education, they've been paying with their education to house people. They haven't been paying with their education to improve the SEND system or the state system. And they couldn't pay with their education to improve the SEND system or the state system because they were now in it. So you can't improve it if it's been flooded. You see, it's not difficult, is it? When we go back to Tarquin, Jemima and Sebastian's parents just need to pay a bit more because they're rich, we ignore the bleeding obvious. And that is that in the state system, there are more wealthy parents. I know. It's a bit like in counselling, you have to get comfortable with the uncomfortable. People don't want to do this bit. They don't like this bit. They don't like the fact that there is wealth in the state system. They find that really awkward and uncomfortable, because for a lot of people, that's them. So it's much easier to say, because you chose to use your money in an independent sector, which we are told is posh, then you're allowed to be rich and posh, and we're allowed to be poor in the state sector. But they're not. And I always get the stats wrong, so I'm not going to do it. But let's just say between 80 and 90% of people who are earning over £180,000 a year use the state system. So that's a lot of money. If you have a look at the percentage of people in the independent sector that are in the lowest tax brackets, it's massive. But we don't look at that, because anyone that's in the independent sector is rich and can absorb this, even though they can't. So this whole thing wasn't thought out. It was always going to end in the ruin that it's ended in. Of course, we will never accept that, because we don't accept that, because we can't accept that. So we're going to turn a blind eye to the fact that councils across the country are saying they will implode by the end of this parliament if there is not vital investment into SEND. And we're not talking a 3-week online training course for a classroom assistant. Now, if those councils don't get the money, our local authorities will be completely stymied, because our local authorities aren't just responsible for children with special educational needs. Think about all the other care aspects that we need in our local communities that come from our local authorities. Gone. So, as I've often said, this is, and never has been, just about children. This has never been about posh kids versus poor kids. That's what Bridget Phillipson wants you to think it is. That's what the Labour Party want you to think it is, because it's an easy win for them, because they want you to see it on face level, and they want you to believe their story, that it is the rich, posh, eating kids that can afford 28 holidays a year and probably have a private jet to take them to school. That kind of assumption and judgment. What they're not telling you is the firemen and the nurses and the cleaners and the people with 2 jobs and the families who have remortgaged their houses or taken out loans or sold their houses and gone into rental so they can afford the school fees for their children who were let down by state. They don't tell you that, because that's the uncomfortable bit, and that's the bit that we have to get comfortable with. That's the bit that we have to look straight in the eye and go, okay, we got this wrong. And we got this wrong, and we hurt children. We disparaged them. We were condescending to them. We invalidated them. We made them invisible. The 26,000 children that have been made to leave school that we don't talk about. Why don't we talk about that? Why is that? Because it's uncomfortable, but it's real. and it's happening. So I'll leave you with that one to ponder when people are saying, those rich people in the private sector. I ask you to reconsider that. It'll take you 2 minutes on Google. It will take you 2 minutes to Google what the tax brackets is, what the general income is in state and in the independent sector. And you'll come up with an answer that you probably don't want, but is the truth. There is not this disparity of wealth in education that people would like you to believe. And whilst Bridget Phillipson is running that rhetoric, just remind yourself that she is supposed to work for all children. She is the education secretary, but she's only representing 93%. The other 7% can go do one, and they have done one. That's why they're invisible. So I would say Bridget Phillipson needs a 7% cut in her salary, and perhaps she could put that into the state system.